Mig langar að bjóða ykkur öll velkomin, landlæknir, heiðursgestur okkar, Ola Didrik Saugstad, fulltrúar bæði úr ME-félagi Noregs og frá Íslandi sem standa að þessari fræðslu hér í dag. Að okkur langar að bjóða ykkur kærlega velkomin bæði hér og þau sem heima sitji eða annars staðar. Það er mikill heiður að vera með ykkur hér í dag og hvað þá í þessu húsi hér hjá Íslensku erfðagreiningu sem að lána okkur salinn sinn og bauð okkur velkomin að vera í þessu heimi og húsi vísindanna með þeim tækifærum til rannsókna sem því fylgja og framfara eins og við þekkjum öll. Og þannig tengist þessi efni sem að verður fjallað hér í dag. Fyrra erindið varðandi ME og long COVID og Ola hefur verið talsmaður þess að við þurfum að sýna þessum hópi meiri skilning, við þurfum að sinna þeim betur, við þurfum að gera meira af rannsóknum og við þurfum að bæta meðferðina. Þannig að það er fyrra efni hans og hann hefur verið talsmaður þessara veikinda síðastliðin 30 ár. Svo kemur hann með seinni erindið og ég fæ að kynna það áður en það verður, en fyrst langar mig að bjóða nýjan landlækni hjartanlega velkomin í þetta góða starf og þökkum heiðurinn að vera hér með okkur í dag og opna fyrir okkur. Já.
Kæra þakkir, gaman að fá að vera hérna með okkur í dag. Ég ætla nú að flytja mitt stutta ávarp á ensku fyrir gestina okkar og ég veit að það er enginn í sérstökum vandræðum með það. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be with you as we open this meeting dedicated to an often misunderstood and overlooked public health challenge, myalgic encephalomyelitis or ME. This condition, which affects millions globally, has long been overlooked and perhaps even neglected. Not only in terms of research and resources, but also in public awareness and understanding. Today we have an opportunity to change that. ME is a chronic debilitating illness that profoundly impacts the lives of those who live with it. For many, it means a life characterized by severe fatigue, pain, cognitive difficulties, and an inability to recover from even minimal exertion. But ME is more than a medical condition, it's a societal issue. It affects families, communities, workplaces, healthcare systems, and yet it remains largely invisible to the broader public. One of the great challenges facing people with symptoms of ME is the pervasive lack of understanding from society and unfortunately often even from the medical community. Too often patients are met with skepticism or stigma when they seek help. Many struggle for years to receive a diagnosis or appropriate care due to misconceptions about the illness. This lack of awareness not only delays treatment, but also deepens the emotional toll on patients and families and others affected. As a public health issue, ME demands our attention, not just from clinicians, but no less from policymakers, educators, employers, and communities at large. Awareness is the first step to change. When society understands ME for what it truly is, a serious life-threatening condition, it becomes possible to foster compassion and action. The lack of research into ME, which Christine also mentioned, has also contributed to its invisibility. Despite affecting millions worldwide, funding for ME research remains inadequate compared to other chronic illnesses. At the same time, we cannot ignore the growing need for further studies into long COVID, which we are going to learn more about today. But long COVID is a condition that shares many similarities with ME, but has emerged as a distinct public health challenge in recent years. Long COVID has left millions grappling with persistent symptoms that impair their physical health, cognitive function, and overall quality of life. Understanding long COVID better will not only help those affected, but also provide valuable insights into post-viral illnesses like ME, strengthening our ability to address these conditions comprehensively within healthcare systems worldwide. Ultimately, addressing ME and other related conditions like long COVID is about much more than healthcare. It's about equity. We need to stay true to the transformative promise of the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development. No one should be left behind simply because their illness is poorly understood or stigmatized. By raising awareness and fostering understanding within the medical establishment and society at large, we can begin to dismantle the barriers that have held back progress for so long. Together, we can transform public health systems into spaces of inclusion and compassion, and in doing so, redefine what it truly means to put patients first. Takk fyrir.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation, for inviting me to come here, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for what you said, which was very important, I think. I'm Ola Saugstad. I'm not really doing research mainly regarding ME. I'm a pediatrician, and I was head of Department of Pediatric Research for 27 years till I was retired, and I was working with newborns. So most of my research has been related to newborn babies. But I've also been interested and involved with ME for 30 years. So what I will do now, I will give us some general background information about ME. Maybe most of you will know this. And I will talk a little bit about some studies. There's so many studies in this field now. And some results. And I'll also touch a little bit about long COVID, as Christian said. I haven't done research myself in long COVID. And then I will, if time allows us, I will tell you very briefly about our experience with, we have a nursing home for the most severely ill ME patients in Norway, which I've been involved with. So we have now summarized our first results, so I would like to share those with you at the end of my lecture. So I might talk a little bit more than 30 minutes, but Christian said that was okay. So when I prepared this lecture, I did as many do. I went to PubMed, and what you can see here is that there has been an exponential increase in publications in this field, especially since 1995. There's 1,200 articles, and only the last month since in 2025, there's so many articles. It's really difficult to keep up with what's happening in this field now, and so many, I would say, very good articles in this field. So it's been changing. It's changed recently. Well, in Norway, we still have a discussion of what is ME, as you have here in Iceland. But WHO, as many of you know, will know that WHO, World Health Organization, defined ME as a neurological disease already back in 1969. But I think there was a big change 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago, since the Institute of Medicine in US published a report with the name Beyond Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Redefining an Illness. And they stated that ME is a biomedical disease. So this is from the report. ME CFS, as you know, CFS is the kind of American terminology, chronic fatigue syndrome. So it's a serious chronic, complex, and systemic disease that frequently and dramatically limits the activities of affected patients. In its most severe form, this disease can consume the lives of those whom it makes physical and mental exertion difficult. Symptoms include trouble thinking, severe tiredness, and other symptoms. And there's no known cause or cure. Care usually means treating the symptoms that most affect a person's life. Some years ago, Lim and co-workers, I think, summarized some of the clinical aspects of ME. So I'll just show you their summary of ME. ME is a debilitating illness that lacks a universal definition, cause, diagnosis, or treatment. It is characterized by chronic fatigue lasting more than 6 months that is not alleviated by rest and is accompanied by complex and fluctuating symptoms of post-exertional malaise, PEM. I'll come back to PEM later. Unrefreshing sleep, cognitive impairment, autonomic dysfunction, and or pain in muscle or joint. And it is associated with poor health-related quality of life, worse than cancer, multiple sclerosis, and stroke. So this can be a very severe condition, as you know. In 2021, new guidelines were published in UK, NICE guidelines, and they also underline now that ME is a complex chronic medical condition affecting multiple body systems, and its pathophysiology is still being investigated. Now, NICE, they have they're characterizing ME patients into 4 groups, and I will not go through all these criteria, but they talk about mild, moderate, severe, and very severe ME. So the very severe ME patients, as I'm sure you all know here, they are in bed all day and they depend on care. They need help with personal hygiene and eating, and are very sensitive to sensory stimuli. And some people may not be able to swallow and may need to be tube fed. They often a lot of pain, and it's really a very severe disease. And I worked as a neonatologist. I've been involved in intensive care for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of very sick patients in my career as a doctor. But when I started to visit the most severely ill ME patients in Norway some 20 years ago, and I was really shocked to see so sick patients staying at home. They didn't have any contact with the healthcare system. They hadn't seen a doctor for years. They were treated by their relatives, parents, for instance, and they were so ill. I was really, really shocked, and that was maybe one reason I continued. I've been involved in ME. So, according to a survey published in Norway some years ago, here you can see the distribution of the severity of ME, and you see 25%, according to this survey, had a mild, but you know, mild ME is not mild because it really affects a person quite a lot. Moderate, 2/3, severe, 1 in 7, and very severe, 1 in 70. We have estimated that there might be 200-300 very severe ME patients in Norway, but I think that this is an underestimation. There are more now. I don't know how many you have in Iceland. Now, Centers for Disease Control in US, they recently, just last year, they updated their guidelines regarding ME, and they again, they emphasize that ME is a biological illness. It affects many body parts and it causes severe fatigue, which is not improved by rest. And these persons, they have problems thinking and sleeping, dizziness, pain, and many other symptoms. And people with ME, they may not look sick, but can't do their normal activities. And ME may get worse after they do any activity, physical or mental. This symptom is called post-exertional malaise, PEM. And after they exert themselves, they may need to stay in bed for an extended time. And according to CDC, about 1 in 4 people with ME are confined to bed at some point in their illness. So what is PEM? Well, if you ask a person with ME, they will maybe describe it as a crash, relapse, or collapse after a mental or physical exertion that was previously tolerated. And it can take hours, days, weeks, or even longer. I have seen ME persons who have never recovered after they have been, for instance, been to visiting a doctor or hospital or had some stress. So the question you should ask to find out if this is PEM or not is what happens when you engage in normal, previously tolerated physical or mental exertion, and how much activity does it take for you to feel ill or to trigger illness worsening, and how long does it take to recover from physical or mental effort? And do you avoid or change certain activities because what happens after you do them? So these are doctors, health professionals should ask these questions if they want to diagnose PEM. Now, who are ME persons? Well, again, the Norwegian ME Association did a survey, and if we look at the sex distribution, you can see here, you see the blue staples, they represent the normal population, the distribution of normal population, 50% women and 50% men. But you see that this is a disease that really hits women more than men. And you can see that from the audience here also, that's the case in here in Iceland. And this is the age distribution. The red bars are represent females and the blue men. And you see that especially for women, we have this peak around 30 to 50 years of age. For men, you don't have this characteristic age peak for some reason. This is another study, also Norwegian data. And now you can see this is these are numbers and incidence. And you see that 2 peaks, one at around 20 years or maybe late teenager, and then around 30 to 50 years of age. And again, you see the blue line represents the men. You don't have this age variation. And it's another thing which is interesting is that although there's predominantly women who is hit by this disease, children, there's no sex difference, or very little sex difference. So this comes after puberty. And here's another estimate of incidence, estimated to 0.36 per thousand in this case, and the ratio female to male 3.7. And again, you can see that here it is not this very predominant age peak. In Norway, it seems that ME is increasing, and I'm sure it is increasing many places in the world, and this is up to 2014, but we know that the numbers are still have increased also after 2014 in all age groups, and also for men, not only for females. Lim, which I referred to recently, he did a meta-analysis of studies that looked into prevalence of ME. So before this study, when people asked me how many people have ME, I said 2 to 4 per thousand, because these were numbers we had seen from the United States. But what he found was that adults had more, 1.45, and more than children and adolescents, and females more than males. So these are much higher numbers. But it also depended on how you diagnose the condition. So if it's diagnosed by an interview, it's higher than if the interview has been followed by a medical test. A review of medical records gives a lower incidence or prevalence in this case. And if there's a doctor who's diagnosing, you see that the prevalence is very low. And this may reflect that many doctors are really skeptical to this diagnosis. But it also depends on which criteria you're using. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the more, if you use the Oxford criteria, there are more people who get the diagnosis than if you use the Holmes criteria, for instance. And seems to be no difference between Western societies and Asian societies, countries, at least in this study. And it also seems that it's increasing. 1990, 90s, 0.96, and 2000, 2 per 100, really. So, and this is again the CDC guidelines from last year. And they have estimated that in US, there is between 800,000 and 3.3 million people who suffer from ME. And I can tell you this is increasing. And it's partly because the COVID-19 pandemic. So Lim estimated that the global prevalence is between 17 to 24 million. And you will see these numbers, many articles. However, very recently, just last month, there was this paper came out where they criticized the Lim data, said this is an underestimation. It is 70 million people who are suffering from ME. How is the quality of life? Well, again, according to this Norwegian survey, 60% of the ME persons feel that their quality of life is poor, and also approximately 15% say this is very poor. Now, I'll just give you some historical background, and maybe most of this is well known for you, but in 1934, there was a small epidemic at the Los Angeles County Hospital, and this was classified as a type of polio, and later it has been suggested this was ME-like disease. And as you know very well here, in the winter 1948-49, the Akureyri veikin was this epidemic in Akureyri, and it was classified as first as polio or polio-like disease, but then they realized that this is not polio because they couldn't find any virus, polio virus, in their patients. And this study was published in American Journal of Hygiene, 1950. And when you read this paper, you can see that the authors, they discuss if this is hysteria or not. But they say it's not hysteria. They say, well, there could be some cases with hysteria. Part of it could be hysteria, but this is a genuine disease. And 8 years later, the Royal Free epidemic was in London, And by contrast to what happened here on Iceland was that this condition was labeled as hysteria. I think that was one reason that this disease has been so misunderstood. So if people had listened to what you said here in Iceland, I think the situation for ME patient had been so much better. In 1986, there was a epidemic around Lake Tahoe in Nevada. It was called Epstein-Barr syndrome, and also I think the term chronic fatigue syndrome was coined after this epidemic. And then in 2003, the Canada criteria were published where PEM was included. You cannot have ME according to Canada criteria if you don't have PEM. And then I mentioned the IOM report and the NICE criteria also. So I'd like to say a few words about what happened here in Iceland and Björn Sigurdsson. And I got this book as a gift from Kristin, and it says your grandfather, isn't it so? Yeah. And it's very impressive when you look into what everything he did. But you look at chapter 5 here, it's about Akureyri Viking. And this is from their publication in the American Journal of Hygiene. And they identified approximately 500 cases at Akureyri and the surrounding. And approximately 25 to 30% of them had the paralytic component of this disease. And then, as I mentioned, 8 years later, the royal free epidemic was described, very similar to actually what was described here in Iceland. But I'm not sure that I had read the paper, I don't know. But anyway, in 1970, this royal free epidemic was summarized by two psychiatrists, McEvedy and Bird. And they looked into this and also collected some other outbreaks of similar diseases. And they coined the term benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. And they said that this is either mass hysteria, is caused by one of two mechanisms, either mass hysteria on the part of the patients or altered medical perception of the community. And this was how this condition was considered the next 45, 50 years, especially in UK. 58 years later, two doctors, Rosemary Underhill and Rosemary Baylod, they were both medical students during the royal free epidemic in 1955. And so they went back and looked into these patients. They interviewed them. The two psychiatrists that didn't talk to any of the patients, they just drew their conclusions without asking the patient, looking at the patients. So they did that, and they analyzed those who are still alive, and this is their conclusion. This study confirms that ME is an organic disease and repudiates the hypothesis of it being a psychosomatic illness. This was published at the end of 2021, actually 3 years ago only. Okay, so how should we diagnose ME? Well, we have to use diagnostic criteria because there's no diagnostic tests yet, biomarkers. But there are possibilities to really distinguish ME patient from healthy controls by medical tests, but you cannot go to your GP and ask to have a ME test yet. But I know that there are companies in US, for instance, that are working very hard to make biomarkers for this condition, and I'm involved in one of these projects myself. So more than 20 different definitions of ME, and this is very important because when we discuss ME, we have to be sure that we're discussing the same patients. And so I'll not go through all this in detail, but for instance, the Oxford criteria, which is including a lot of psychosomatic conditions. For instance, the PACE study was based on the Oxford criteria, and it has a very high prevalence if you diagnose according to Oxford criteria. And then we have the Canada consensus criteria, which includes PEM, came in 2003, and they also have exclusion criteria. I'll show you in a second. And then we have some other definitions which are more or less built on the Canada consensus criteria. So according to Canada definition, a person with ME must fulfill these criteria: fatigue or PEM after exertion, sleeping disorders, pain. So this is, you have to have that in order to get the diagnosis. And 2 or more neurological cognitive manifestations, 1 or more symptoms from 2 categories within autonomic, neuro, endocrine, or immunological manifestations, and duration more than 6 months. And you have to exclude diseases which can explain fatigue, sleep disorders, pain, and cognitive dysfunction. So that's in short how the Canada criteria are working. And this is just another illustration of, if you're interested in the Canada criteria, you can see an illustration of which factors which are of importance. So what causes ME? Well, I don't think we really know what causes ME. And ME may have more than one cause, or there might be several environmental factors that triggers it. But it is important to do research and investigations on different areas, including infection and genetics. And this is, of course, important since we're here at Decode. And here's a summary of the most important abnormalities which has been described: reduction in cerebral blood flow, endothelial dysfunction, a reduction in systemic oxygen supply, a reduced peak oxygen consumption, an increase in ventricular cerebrospinal fluid lactate levels, hypermetabolism, and increased levels of autoantibodies. I don't have time to go into all this, but I will just show you some results which I think are of interest. One of the first most important studies, in my opinion, was published the same month or some weeks later after the IOM report in 2015. And this was from Columbia University in US. And what they did, and Maddie Hornick was the first author of this study, was that they had measured cytokines in blood of ME patients. Cytokines are inflammatory markers, for instance, and a number of cytokines. And since I started to go to international ME Congress in the middle of the 1990s, and there had been so many studies about cytokines, and some studies said, well, we find increased cytokine levels in ME patients. Others said, we don't find increased cytokines. So what Maddie did was that she looked into those patients who had had ME for a short time, and short in this means less than 3 years, and compared with those who had ME for a longer time. And then and she looked at a broad panel of cytokines, and what she found then was that there were a number of cytokines which were significantly changed in ME patients compared with controls, and especially interferon gamma was, and she is emphasizing this. And so this can not be used as a biomarker, but you'll find that if you do this study, such studies in individual ME patients, you will find changes, but not if they had had ME for a long time. So this was very important. Another important finding, in my opinion, was that, first of all, Japanese scientists who were able to detect neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain. So this was a paper from 2018, and in 2018, neuroinflammation became one of the main research interests for ME research in United States. And some years ago, Jared Younger, I'm sorry I don't have the full reference for this, I should have had that, but anyway, they did a similar study as the Japanese and looked into the brain with very sophisticated methods. You cannot do an ordinary MRI study. But what they were able to show was that ME patients, they had increased temperature in the brain. They didn't measure it with directly, but they could estimate it indirectly. There was more lactate in the brain, and they had increased choline, which is a marker of inflammation, and activated microglia. Microglia are the inflammatory cells in the brain. So they could show that these cells were activated. And there was a leakage of the so-called blood-brain barrier, blood with double O, sorry for that. And so Jared Younger concluded that ME persons have an inflammation in the brain, but what is the cause? Another study, this is from Australia, some years ago, they were so sure that ME is an ion channel defect. They were able to show that this receptor called TRPM3, which is related to calcium mobilization, was defect in ME patients. And I talked to them at one of the meetings we have in London every year, and they were so sure they had found the cause of ME, that it was this receptor TRPM3. What is interesting is that this receptor, it seems that naltrexone, which is an opioid antagonist in low doses, can restore impaired TRPM3 channel activity. And this is interesting because, as I'm sure most of you know, maybe all of you know, is that low-dose naltrexone is used to treat ME patients. And actually, there was a Finnish study, it's been published now, where they showed that almost 75% of those who tried low-dose naltrexone had some improvement, had some response. But you have to try it for several weeks before you can see any effect. So some Norwegian colleagues, Fluge and co-workers in Bergen, they published this study some years ago in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, where they proposed some of the pathomechanisms of ME. I'm not sure if you can see this, but I have written it down for you here. So it seems that after an infection, you get an immune response, and at least many of these patients, they produce autoantibodies, not all of them, but at least some of them. And this may also lead to vascular dysregulation. They have endothelial defects been shown, and a defect autoregulation, which may result in hypoxia. And of course, they have compensatory mechanism also. What is interesting, they have been able to show that this enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase is impaired in ME patients. And this is an important enzyme because it kind of is important for the production of energy. So what this enzyme promotes is the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA, those of you who know biochemistry, is so important into the so-called Krebs cycle, which we need to in order to produce ATP energy in the cells. So why is this of interest? Yeah, it's interesting because thymine, B1, is so-called the cofactor for this enzyme. And why is that interesting? I don't know how it is in Iceland, but in Norway, a lot of ME patients are now eating huge amounts of B1. And someone will say that they are improved, and you have to combine it with B2, and it's very complicated, but it's basically B1. And this makes sense. You see that this can maybe restore the action of pyruvate dehydrogenase. And I will not talk much about therapy. How is time-wise?
Fine.
Okay, thank you. Just I want to mention one study from Norway, from the Bergen group. This is Ingrid Rekland. And this is a study with the test of cyclophosphamide in ME patients. As many of you know, the same group had tested rituximab, which is also used in cancer therapy, and now they test out cyclophosphamide. And this is what they found. You look here to the to the left here. You will see that they made an assessment of the patients with the so-called SF36 what do you call it, scheme, and they could show that approximately 60% of the patients responded to cyclophosphamide, and those who responded, you can see how the SF36 improves. The red line here, and here I just show you the Norwegian reference values for SF36, and you see it should be up in the 90s. So these patients are quite severely affected, but you see that there is an improvement. I think this is quite promising, and this group is now testing out different cytotoxic drugs for treating ME patients. And then a few words about long COVID and ME. I think it's been known for many years, every doctor knows that a number of infections may represent a risk for later diseases. Influenza, Epstein-Barr, streptococci, CMV, varicella, and now SARS-CoV-19, etc. So this is well known. Everybody knows that. It has been estimated, I think this is actually an Icelandic study. I was not able to find it at PubMed. Maybe some of you can help me. Estimated that 500 million cases, COVID cases. And if 1%, 1 out of 100 develops ME, it means 5 million more cases globally. It has been estimated that, again, that maybe 5 million more persons develop ME after this pandemic. And this is from Iceland. And they and these authors, you probably know them, yeah, show that 7 to 8% of affected persons developed long COVID, and 1% had symptoms after 1 year. So is COVID-19 associated with ME? Yes, I think so. And here, if we look at the symptoms for long COVID, fatigue, post-exertional malaise, brain fog, select sensory, motor symptoms, headache, memory issues, insomnia, muscle aches, etc. It's very overlapping with what we know about ME. Very similar clinically. I mentioned the endothelial function, which we know it's endothelial function is not normal in ME patients. It's been also shown in post-COVID patients, and this is a study from Germany, and I don't know if you can read it very well, but you see there post-COVID without ME and post-COVID with ME and non-COVID ME patients. And you see there's so many similarities. Look here, there's the female, male rate, etc. You can go through this in detail. And they also have PEM as in ME. And here's another look at other symptoms here. I will not go through that in detail, but very, very similar to what we see in ME. So these authors, Carmen Scheibenbogen and Klaus Witt, they very recently published a paper. Actually, I saw this in January, but it was officially published in February, just a month ago, or 6 weeks ago. And so there we have the PCS post-COVID. Most of them improve, but some of them are not improving, and they go on to post-COVID ME CFS, as they call it. And you see the risk factors here. I have to underline that, of course, post-COVID is also much more than ME, because you have this microvascular capillary disturbance also in post-COVID. But you see all these risk factors, which we also recognize when we talk about ME. And they think that skeletal muscles play a key role for development of both post-COVID and ME. And here again, there are a number of triggering or risk factors: thromboinflammation, autoantibodies, endothelial dysfunction, autonomic dysfunction, etc. And so they think that, for instance, if you have some muscle problem, perfusion disturbance, for instance, and this affects the so-called sodium-potassium pump in the cell and leads to mitochondrial dysfunction and muscle damage. And I think that, and so what I say that we have a vicious circle. These authors are so convinced to say that we have now really understood what ME is. And it's a skeletal muscle and mitochondrial damage disease. That's the final step of this disease. So this is what they wrote in their article. ME is the self-reproducing mitochondrial dysfunction. Its dysfunction most likely constitutes the final and common disturbance of ME, which locks the patients in a vicious circle from which they can hardly escape. As the disease is self-maintaining at this stage, treatment of the original trigger, a persistent virus or vascular inflammation, does most likely not lead to a therapeutic success. ME is no more an enigmatic disease for which therapeutic concepts are missing. We appeal to politicians, pharmaceutical companies, and stakeholders to support the rapid development of such promising new drugs. And they are now testing out a new drug which affects the sodium-potassium pump in the cells. And it will be very interesting to follow this project. And then just a few minutes at the end, I'll just share with you some of the experience we had with Røysemtunet, which is, I said we had a dream because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we had discovered that very and severely ill ME persons often are treated by their relatives, parents or children, and there was no healthcare involved. So the idea was that why not build our own institution where you can care for ME patients based on present knowledge, where the patient is in the center and we respect each person's need. And we did that. Sorry, this is in Norwegian. And we opened this unit at Røysemtunet, which is 75 kilometers north of Oslo, in June 2021. And we just recently summarized our experience, the first 3 years, and we have submitted this paper. It's under review in this journal. And so I just very quickly want to show you our results. So our approach at Røysemtunet is that ME is a biomedical disease, and we are following actually the NICE guidelines. Every person should be paid respect, and we should individualize the care. Our aim was that we should register every patient with a SF36 at admission, and every 3 to 6 months later. It's not easy to do it because these patients are so sick that we cannot do it. And we also want to register with a Fitbit, as I have here. Every morning I see if I'm alive and how I've been sleeping. And so that was the aim. But again, not all of them are able to have a watch like this because it's painful for them. But so what we did was that we did a clinical assessment. And so we said that those who have moved up one step, one level, according to the NICE guidelines, you remember, mild, moderate, severe, very severe. One step up is a significant improvement. That was the primary outcome. And secondary outcome was improvement within the NICE level. So that's maybe they were able to take a little bit more care of the hygiene or eating, brushing their teeth, go to the bathroom, etc. So these were the outcome measures. So we had 31 persons during this period admitted to the unit, and we didn't accept young people. You had to be adult, 18 years or more. Now, 4 of these did not get their diagnosis confirmed at admission, so then we have 27 left, and 2 left early. We said that they had to stay at least 3 months there to be included. So we ended up with 25 ME patients, and of these 18 were very severely affected and 7 were severely affected. And then we asked for informed consent, and there was 1 person who did not give us informed consent. So we ended up with 24. But the 25 were 20 females and 5 males, and you see the age range here. And so here we have the age range, women 39 years, exactly the peak, you remember. And men, they were a little bit younger, 10 years younger. And when you looked at those who were very severely ill, they had a mean age of 36 years, and severely ill 41, but there was no significant difference. But 7 of these patients improved significantly according to our criteria. They went up 1 or 2 levels at a nice criteria. This was significant, and that is more than 30% of them. And then 5 showed some improvement, secondary outcome. So totally 12 out of 24 had some improvement. That is 50% of these patients had some improvement during the stay. So that illustrates how the disease severity shifted. You see the black bars before treatment and the white bar, open bar after. And we even had 2 patients who moved from very severe to moderate. So we think that was quite interesting. And we looked at the age of those who improved. And the age of those who improved was in mean 30 years. And it was actually 10 years younger than those who did not improve. So it seems that the effect was best for those who were younger, maybe had ME for a shorter time. So we think this is the first report from a specialized care unit for the most severely ill ME patients. And 7 out of 24 showed significant clinical improvement. We don't know why. I didn't mention that, but we gave them some vitamins, antioxidants, and naltrexone, low dose, and Abilify for those who wanted it. So we cannot sort out, was it the treatment or was it this environment? Or maybe a combination. But anyway, 50% of the patients showed significant or partial improvement. And I think that, as far as I know, I don't think anyone has shown any similar results, at least. And those who improved were younger than those who did not improve. But we don't, as I mentioned, we don't know the mechanism behind that. So we hope we can find out in the next years a little bit more about that. Yeah, so we shall overcome this condition. Thank you.
Do we have any questions before the coffee break? Okay, and we can also have informal discussions during coffee and after. But I really wish before we go for the break to thank Maria Heimis, the Director of Health, for an inspiring opening for us, and Ola Saugstad for a very extensive overview and very clear and concise, because so much has happened, and for giving us the hope in the end. Both we know so much more, and we also, there are so many more opportunities to help people both with the symptoms and possibly deeper help in future treatments based on the knowledge that we have, which is so important. So thank you for the hope and the overview. And concerning Iceland, because you did ask in the beginning what our statistic was, when the ME Association talked to me 7 years ago to become involved here, I asked the Directorate of Health, and they said at the time, with the WHO diagnosis that we've had since '69, that there were 100 people diagnosed in Iceland, which were women, and 50 which were men, which I found extremely interesting, because 10 years before, when we had champions working on ME, Sverrir Bergman and many others who were doing fantastic work, but who had passed away, they said when they were looking at that, they thought there were probably around 2,000 people in Iceland. So when people are not aware and are not using the diagnosis, and this is one of the reasons for the founding of the Akureyri Clinic, is to work for making a register so we can register and also educate doctors to use the correct diagnoses and to have this consultation service. And it's also being worked on here in the south of Iceland with the University Hospital on opening a clinic also here. So we are taking steps forward, although much slower than we wish. And there was a European a survey done by the ME societies working together, which I have to say are such powerful societies because there are so many ill patients and some of their caregivers who come, but they are very strong and working together. And they did a survey, and Iceland was kind of at the bottom. This is from 2021. It takes on average an ME patient 7 years and many different specialties before getting the diagnosis and then the understanding which they deserve. So that's something we have something to strive for, and we really need to fix here. And thank you for coming here and being part of helping us to do that. So thank you very much. And now we have a coffee break, and we'll start again at 10 minutes after 3, we'll get together again. Thank you. Okay. Everyone, welcome again. Now this is the second lecture that we have, and the part of me, which is an accident and emergency physician, all of my cells are really excited to hear this discussion about oxygen and in resuscitation of newborns and the tremendous change and effect it has had in the world. And it's also for me a very significant story about research, clinical observation, and working to change medical dogma, because it's often very hard to change systems in place, and it can be a struggle. So having perseverance, thank you, Ola, for your perseverance, and asking questions and questioning the dogma, questioning the norm. If we are not open for asking the questions, and if we are also not critical, we need to be open for new things and critical about what we've been doing if we should be doing things differently. And this story encompasses so many things. And again, it also connects back to ME and long COVID, because we're talking about oxygen. And oxygen is very important. It's the first thing we do when we are born is breathe. And oxygen and how we use it in our body, which is a problem that we have been seeing in ME, is that it's not being used as efficiently as we need, which makes us ill, that it's so important that I'm very expansive, and I see this is all very connected. I'm just absolutely delighted and honored to have Ola here, and looking forward to this second lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Kristin. This is what I really am doing. I mean, I've been doing in my life is working with newborns and oxygenation, and I'm not sure all of you are interested in oxygen. But as Kristin said, what I have discovered is that there are lots of similarities between what I found myself and which can be applied to ME at the end of the day. So that's an interesting experience. What I will tell you, I will make this a little bit shorter, is about oxygenation of the newborn in the delivery room, air or oxygen. So if we start with some historical aspects, oxygen was described as an element in 1792, 93. It was Priestley in England and Scheele in Sweden. Scheele was probably the first to describe it, but it's said that his handwriting was so poor that nobody understood what he was writing. So Priestley is honored. So this was 1792. And very quickly after oxygen was described as an element, at the end of the 70s, they started to give it to newborn babies. And for 200 years, I think it was a dogma that you should use pure oxygen when you resuscitate newborn babies. So, as late as in 1992, American Heart Association said that in their guidelines for newborn resuscitation, said that you don't need to be concerned about giving 100% oxygen to newborn babies during resuscitation because it's such a brief period, just a few minutes. So it doesn't do any harm to newborn babies. And I think that was really the paradigm that time. So I started to question this actually in the late 1970s. I'll come back to that. And in the end of the 1980s, we started to do animal experiments. We developed a newborn piglet model, which where we resuscitated hypoxic newborn piglets with different oxygen concentrations. And we were able to show that you can resuscitate a newborn piglet as well with air as with 100% oxygen. So in 1993, we published the first clinical study. It was a pilot study with 42 patients resuscitated with air and 42 patients resuscitated with 100% oxygen. And we were able to show that the outcome was more or less similar. So that told us that it might be doable to resuscitate with air instead of 100% oxygen. And in 1998, we published the so-called RESOR-2 study, which was a multi-center study, where we were able to show again that actually the outcome was a little bit better with air compared with 100% oxygen. And then some years later, the first meta-analysis were published. And in 2010, the international guidelines were changed from 100% oxygen to air for term or near-term babies. So as all of those who work with oxygen or in medicine knows that oxygen is essential for life, of course, but it also is potentially is toxic and even mutagenic. And one reason for that is that oxygen also produces so-called free radicals, and it induces oxidative stress. So even though oxygen is critical to life and to newborns, we know that too much oxygen can cause oxidative stress, and this may induce injury to the lung and other organs as well. Bronchopulmonary dysplasia, for those who are not into neonatology, this might be maybe a new term, and I don't think I will spend much time going into that, but it means that oxygen is toxic. Too much oxygen is toxic. So when we're talking about oxygen therapy in the newborn, we have to find the right balance. But first of all, we give oxygen, sufficient oxygen, to avoid what we call anaerobic metabolism. And it is important to promote the optimal growth, both of the brain, but also the rest of the body, and to prevent what we call vasoconstriction of the pulmonary arteries. And every doctor, especially every neonatologist, newborn doctor, knows that we have to minimize the adverse effects of oxygen. Satyan Lakshminarayanan is a famous neonatologist in California, and is also an artist, so he makes this drawing, and he asked this question: why do pediatricians and neonatologists love oxygen? And you can see this is himself coming into the delivery room with a, this oxygen tank to give to this blue baby. Well, I think there are probably several answers to this question, but one answer is that in 1861, Little, and the year after Mitchell, they reported brain damage in infants who had suffered what you call birth asphyxia, lack of oxygen during delivery. And after that, people are giving oxygen after birth. Very, very liberal use of oxygen. Another important, I think, reason for why oxygen was given so freely in the delivery room was the introduction of the APGAR score. And Virginia Apgar was an American anesthesiologist, and in 1953 she coined this score, the APGAR score, which is still used to assess every newborn baby, more or less in the world, or at least in the western part of the world, most places in the world. And in order to achieve a high APGAR score, it goes from 0 to 10. And to achieve an APGAR score of 9 or 10, the baby has to be pink. But newly born babies, they're not pink. The first minutes after birth, there's only one way to make a newborn baby pink, and that is to give them oxygen. And this is what happened many places in the world. In order to have a high APGAR score, they gave even healthy babies a dash of oxygen to pink them up. And they thought that an APGAR score of 10 is better than 9, or 9 is better than 8. And that's not true. Maybe it's better to have an APGAR score of 8 instead of 10. So what happens if you give oxygen to a baby with healthy lungs? You get an enormous increase in the oxygen tension, PO2, the red line here. And this is, today we know that this is toxic. By contrast, if you give air, the blue line, you get a slow, this is actually for newborn lambs, but you find the same in newborn babies. You get a slow restoration and normalization, and we see that the oxygen tension is within the normal level. Now, before 1998, the world map, when we talk about newborn resuscitation and oxygen, looked like this. All guidelines recommended to use 100% oxygen. And those places where they didn't have access to oxygen, they thought that if we don't have oxygen, we cannot resuscitate newborn babies. So a baby who was not breathing and he didn't have oxygen was just put away. They didn't try even to rescue this baby. And but at that time, those babies who were resuscitated, they had this very, pathologic, I would say, increase in PO2. Very recently, just in November last year, this book was published at Oxford University Press, 50 studies every neonatologist should know. And I read this book with special interest. The authors here, you can see the names here. Yeah, interest because the first study they discussed in this book was the RESOR-2 study, which I had published myself. So I will just mention a little bit about this study, which was published in 1998. This was a multi-center study we had 10 centers from 6 countries. I'll show this in a moment. We were able to enroll 703 babies. We ended up with 609 infants that were included, and 288 were resuscitated with room air and 321 with 100% oxygen. So here we have the centers and the numbers, and it's from 6 countries, from India, Philippines, Egypt, Spain, Estonia, and Norway. So this is what we found. It's the heart rate, and heart rate is a very sensitive indicator of how efficient your resuscitation is. So if you're doing a good resuscitation, the heart rate picks up very quickly within a few seconds. And you see here, there's no difference in how the heart rate is restored. So you have actually the same effect by using air as with 100% oxygen. Here are blood gases. Also surprising that the PO2, the oxygen tension, is not very much higher if you use 100% oxygen compared with room air. And here we have the APGAR scores. And here we saw not only a tendency, but we saw that the APGAR score was actually higher in the babies who received air. So it was the opposite of what people have believed, that you need to give oxygen to increase the APGAR score. So this was at 1 minute of age. And we also found that another new finding was that those babies who had been given air, they took their first breath, the first cry, earlier than those who were given oxygen. 30 seconds in mean. And that's quite a long time when we're talking about resuscitation, 30 seconds. So this was a new observation. And in the beginning, people didn't believe it. It's not true. But it seems that oxygen is depressing the ventilation of the baby. And it's now been reproduced by several others. And then we looked at death. And what you call hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, that's brain affection in these babies. And what you can see, look at the bottom line here, death within 28 days, and look at the multivariate. You see that there is a reduction in mortality for those babies who receive air, 30% reduction, or almost a 40% reduction. But this was not significant, very close to be significant. So we concluded that this is promising. We need to do more studies. And this is the conclusion of the description of the RESER-2 study in this book. So the authors who wrote this article about the chapter about the RESER-2 study said that it showed that it was possible to allocate newborn infants to 2 different resuscitation strategies in the second following birth. It facilitated further studies to answer this question with higher methodological standards. It provided a template to address other important questions to fill the evidence vacuum of delivery room care. And the findings themselves led to important practice change, saving countless lives around the world. So in 2004, the first meta-analysis, because several other groups now started to test out room air resuscitation in newborn babies. And so the first meta-analysis was published in 2004. We published one in 2005, and this is meta-analysis from 2008, where we now had 10 studies from different parts of the world, including more than 2,000 babies who had been resuscitated with either air or 100% oxygen. These are babies born close to term. And what you can see here is that now there is a significant reduction in mortality in babies who were resuscitated with air. It was a 30% reduction in mortality. And this, the result of this was that international guidelines were changed 2 years later, in 2010. And it was stated that in term infants receiving resuscitation at birth with positive pressure ventilation, it is best to begin with air rather than 100% oxygen. So what happens if you give 100% oxygen? And again, Satyan Lakshminrusama, he has illustrated that. Show this. If you resuscitate with air, you get this oxygen tension, PO2. It normalizes within a few minutes, as you can see here. And some free radicals are generated. By contrast, if you resuscitate with 100% oxygen, you get this enormous peak, really toxic peak. And you get this, I call it a tsunami of free radicals. And this affects the newborn babies. We have shown now in animal experiments that high oxygen tension induces constriction of the cerebral vessels. And it also induces inflammation in the brain, as in ME, by the way. And you get increased constriction of the pulmonary arteries, the opposite of what people believed. And it also shown that it can damage the heart and the kidney and probably other organs as well. It's also been associated with increased risk of leukemia in children. It's a fourfold increased risk of developing leukemia in babies who have been resuscitated with high oxygen, only the first 10 minutes of life. So in 2019, a new meta-analysis was published in this field, basically the same patients as we had in 2008. This is an American study. And again, they found that there was approximately a 30% reduction in mortality if you resuscitate with air instead of 100% oxygen. And these authors, they concluded that there will unlikely be any further studies on this topic. Well, we know that things can change, but this was their conclusion. And this is, of course, interesting because in 2000, when we kind of started and finished the RESOR-2 study, it was estimated that 4 million babies had lack of oxygen during birth. 4 million out of approximately 130 million newborn babies globally every year. And we found a reduction in 30%, or it was an absolute reduction in 5%. And you can calculate yourself how many babies or deaths this can prevent. It's approximately 200,000. Enormous numbers because there's so many deliveries and so many babies who suffer from birth asphyxia. So resuscitation with air reduces mortality. Another issue I'll talk about when I go to the neonatal unit here in Akureyri is what we do with premature babies, because we haven't really solved that problem yet. So why did I start thinking about this? Well, I started with, there was someone else who has done their PhD in Uppsala, at least, yeah. There you are, yeah. And I also started my research in Uppsala, and I started to measure this compound, this metabolite, which is hyperxanthine. And hyperxanthine is a purine metabolite. It's a breakdown product from ATP, the energy store in the cells. So I measured hyperxanthine to see if I can use it as a marker of lack of oxygen, birth asphyxia. And this is from a study we did in dogs, actually, with endotoxic shock. And this was terminal endotoxic shock. And this was a study of doing something completely different. But I asked the guy who did it, could I be allowed to resuscitate these dogs and measure hyperxanthine the last minutes? And I did, and this is what I found. You see, this is an exponential increase in hyperxanthine during resuscitation after hypoxia, because they were hypoxic. And is this of interest? Yes, it is, because here is hyperxanthine, it's a breakdown product from ATP. And when it's oxidized in the presence of an enzyme named xanthine oxidase, oxygen radicals are generated. So I suggested that that this may be important, that it may play a role in what we call reoxygenation injury. And I think it was quite simple then to draw the conclusion that in such a situation where the hyperxanthine concentration increases, one should be careful giving oxygen in order to reduce the number of free radicals. So this was the idea behind that. So I mentioned that we did a number of animal experiments, and I will just and show you some of these experiments. So we have carried out this, we used this model for more than 20 years now. I think I had 30 or more PhD students working with this model. I'll show you some of the results. So this is what happens when you resuscitate with different oxygen concentrations, 21%, which is room air, 40%, 60%, and 100% oxygen. You see how the PO2 increases, as we've shown already. And we also measured free radical generation, hydroxyl radicals. And you see, it follows the same pattern. The more oxygen you give, the more free radicals you generate. And we also looked at DNA damage and found the same pattern. So there's a relation between the oxygen you give and how much DNA is damaged. And then we changed, or we added another model, a newborn mouse model. So we had newborn mice, and we made them hypoxic. We had a hypoxic chamber, and then we randomized them to be resuscitated with air, 40% oxygen, 60% oxygen, and 100% oxygen. And we looked at different organs. And this is what happened to these newborn mice. You see that the oxygen saturation was 99% started, and it decreased to 49 and 42%. You see heart rate, 700. You can try to count it. And also the respiratory rate is very high, but this is how mice can cope with such situations. So we looked at some genes. So I thought that since they're decode, it'd be interesting to show you some of our results. We did whole genomic studies in these animals. And so what we found was, for instance, that in the brain, genes related to oxidative phosphorylation, that is the production of ATP, the energy of the cells, are downregulated when you resuscitate with high oxygen, 60% or 100% oxygen. And actually, the oxidative phosphorylation, it happens in 5 steps. And the genes related to all these steps. And we found that genes related to all these 5 steps in oxidative phosphorylation are downregulated when we give a high oxygen. And this means that if you give oxygen, you may reduce the ATP production. And maybe that's why there's an increased mortality. We don't know. In the lungs, we looked at the other, we found out other results and found that genes related to the mTOR system is upregulated. So what is the mTOR? Mammalian, rapamycin is at the end of this. This is a system. Oh gosh, my battery is running low. This is a system which is very important for growth and development, and it seems that this is upregulated. It's very interesting that now it's tested out in a clinical study, mTOR inhibitors in ME patients, and I heard that there's quite promising results. So I'm at the end my lecture, I think, and the battery is low, so that fits well. So the conclusion of these studies is that term and near-term infants should be, if they need ventilation, they should start with air. Premature infants is another story, there's another lecture, but they need some oxygen. We don't know exactly how much oxygen. But we try to follow the so-called Goldilocks principle. You remember the history of the Goldilocks? We had to give just the right amount. But what is the right amount? When is it too little or too much? So here are some references, and here are some of my close collaborators from Spain and United States, Australia. And with this, I'll thank you for your attention. And for those who are interested, I've written a book about this, Fighting for Air. It's published in Norwegian, Swedish, Italian, and English. Thank you.
Any questions at the end of a long day here?
Do you know when this changed in Iceland? Because you said the accreditation were changed in 2010. But they changed immediately, do you know?
I was in Spain.
I think Iceland. You know, so the first country which changed was Canada in 2006, because ILCOR, the international society making these guidelines, they said in 2005 that you can choose air or 100% oxygen. So there was a process. So Canada immediately changed to 2006 to air, and the year after Australia changed, number 2. But then Russia, Finland, Sweden, UK, the Netherlands, Spain changed to air. Norway was one of the slowest. Denmark, I think Iceland changed around 2010, but I'm not quite sure. So, yeah. Yeah.
So you have results from leukemia. Do you think this is something that follows them further into their lives?
We don't know, but we would like to do that. This was a study from 2 studies actually, one from US and one from Sweden, showing this association, only an association, but it's quite interesting. Yeah.
About hypoxanthine.
Yeah.
Could you use it as a proxy for mitochondrial dysfunction in ME?
Yeah. Actually, we've done a study with Jonas Bergqvist. I've done a study with Jonas Bergqvist in Uppsala, where we measured hyperxanthine in severely ill ME patients, and also lactate and a number of other metabolites. And this is not published yet, and I haven't seen the real results, but I know the results. And what we did with these patients who were in bed, we measured hyperxanthine and lactate, and then we asked them to stand up, for instance, if those who could do that, and we measured again hyperxanthine, and we know hyperxanthine is elevated in the resting state, and it increased when they stood up.
And for doctors who can't order hypoxanthine, could they use a proxy even to hypoxanthine, like uric acid or something?
No, not uric acid, because it's not a good marker. And the reason I picked out hyperxanthine is that nobody had measured hyperxanthine before I measured in humans. But I estimated that it had to be very low, and it was true. It was between 0 and 5 micromole per liter. But uric acid is much higher, 200 to 300 micromole. So it's much more difficult to pick up an increase in uric acid than in hyperxanthine. But theoretically, yes, uric acid could also be a marker.
Like a cheap proxy?
Yeah. But the interesting thing is that there are some people say that, and maybe we'll see that tomorrow also here, that treating ME patient, but long COVID patient with hyperoxia. And that might be a good idea, but on the other hand, if they have an elevated hyperxanthine level and you give them oxygen, it might be, in the long term, might be detrimental.
There are so many questions unanswered, and this is a trip will be taken tomorrow to the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, and they are doing some very interesting trials on low COVID, some of the ME patients and some of the people that are ill in the environment. And they'll be speaking at Læknadar. I've asked them to give us a lecture on their results on the Icelandic group that they're looking at in next January. And they're taking this really seriously. They have strict criteria and are working and seeing how could it help. One of the rules, there's just so many things we don't know. That's why we need all of these questions. Is possibly the effect of the hyperbaric oxygen chamber could that be because of relative hypoxia when people leave the chamber, and then it starts things up again? These pathways, and that's one of the things I really wish to thank Ola, that he takes these topics. He's covered 2 huge topics with us before and after coffee today. He flew in from Norway this morning. And
this night.
this night.
4 o'clock in the morning.
Standing but he is somehow able to make these very complicated subjects and have been able to go through a lot of research. Actually, that you can really understand it, using language that we can understand, and you really think you can understand things for a while. It's a beautiful sensation. Thank you for giving us this and explaining.
It's interesting, the systems involved, which I showed in our animal experiments. It's the same as systems that are involved in ME, basically. So,
any further questions before we thank Ola? Keep on studying. Yes. Thank you for your curiosity and your humility. I mean, when I told some of my colleagues that Ola was coming, they were just, wow, he's a rock star. Wow. So really, thank you.